afternoon, everyone. We will be getting started in. We'll be starting in about 10 minutes time. So thank you very much for joining us. I think there are more people that are going to join. We'll be starting exactly at 2. We'll be starting in a few minutes time. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much. We should be starting in a few minutes time. We'll be starting in a few minutes time. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure there are more people that are going to join as well. Thank you very much. We'll be starting shortly.
Simba.
Afternoon. How are you?
Good, and yourself?
I'm good. Good to see you.
And you, Simba, look at you with glasses. Are you entering middle age?
Yeah, I'm getting there.
Yay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Otherwise, how is Cape Town and work?
Cape Town is finally heating up, so that is wonderful news for me. It was a very long and very cold and very wet winter, so we are entering into summer, so it's all good, yeah. And I'm not teaching Simba, so I think that's a first for me.
Oh, that's good. That's good. That's typical Cape Town
Yeah,
conditions.
no, I'm finally looks like I'm finally allowed into the inner circles. I don't have to teach day and night, so this is wonderful.
Okay. That's good. Yeah, no, I think we should get more people joining us at 2. Yeah. I don't know, maybe if you want to try if you have any PowerPoints, and then I think that I also wanted to email about if it's possible for us to do a recording, or maybe you don't want it to be recorded, then we will not record it.
Oh, Simba, if you record it, it's fine. It is still a paper in the well, it's a book in the making. So what I will be saying is based on the drafts. So definitely not yet published. I had an email from one of your visitors. I can't find the guy's name now. Where is my friend now? Marina, here we go. Ashana Raber. Richard Raber. Do you know the person?
Maybe part of the mailing list, maybe part of the broader mailing list.
All right. Yeah.
Not personally.
Okay. Yeah. No. So that was interesting. He can't be joining us today, so he sent an apology. So he might find the recording interesting, or not, but at least you can.
Yeah. No, I think we are having a bigger mailing list since we started. So there's a growing interest in the seminars.
Wonderful news. That's wonderful news. Samarashi, you learned something at humor.
Yeah.
How are things in Kimberley?
Yeah, no, we are managing. It was also a bit cold, but now it's getting better. But you know, Kimberley is both extremes, sometimes very cold and very hot as well.
That's it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I've been there a few times, and every time in winter, I wouldn't be able to live there in winter. I think it's too much.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know how it is. Yeah, no, I think we should have if a few more people joining us.
Sure.
And maybe as we wait, I would maybe start introducing you so that we get started at 2. I know you are rushing after that. You're rushing for the meeting, the PhD defense. So
That's it. Not my
yeah,
own. Let's be clear.
yeah. Yeah, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I think we should have more people joining us at 2 or after 2. So it's an absolute honor for me to welcome and introduce a very special guest today. Prof. Ilana is very special to me, and not only because she was my PhD supervisor, but also because she's been an incredibly generous mentor since I started my PhD, and has profoundly really shaped my intellectual work as well as my professional growth. And I'm really indebted to Prof. Ilana for teaching me the art and the rigor of doing ethnographic work and ethnographic writing. Of course, the way that she taught, I think, has stood up, with me for a very long time up to date. So, Prof. Ilana van Wyk is an anthropologist, and she earned a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS in London, and has taught at several universities, including the University of Pretoria, the University of Cape Town, the University of Stellenbosch, SOAS, as well as the London School of Economics. She has published widely on Pentecostal charismatic churches in South Africa, and her monograph, A Church of Strangers, was published in 2014 by Cambridge University Press, and was longlisted for the Clifford Geertz Prize. She has also written on conspicuous consumption and has an edited book, Conspicuous Consumption in Africa, which was co-edited with Professor Deborah Pozzo in 2019 and published by Wits University Press. She's also written extensively on the South African lottery and on the intellectual histories of anthropology in Southern Africa and South Africa, and particularly published a book with Jimmy Peters in 2022 titled A Tale of Two Anthropologists. So Prof. Ilana was also the editor-in-chief of Anthropology Southern Africa and serves on a number of editorial boards. She's currently working on the history of money and lotteries in the VOC Cape, based on work in the Western Cape archives, as well as archives in the Hague and in Amsterdam, as well as the London Library and the Mauritanian National Archives. So without further ado, I think let me allow Prof. Ilana to get us started.
Thank you very much, Samvarashi, and thank you very much for the invitation and the warm welcome. It is an absolute honor to be here today and to have been invited into your seminar series. And I'm looking forward to the comments that I hope some of you might have. Colleagues, friends, for those of you listening to this, this is a project still in the making. So I'm busy writing a book, and this is one of the chapters that lead up to the full picture. So it is in some parts written and some parts, still in the making. So if you will forgive me for that incompleteness. I'm going to try and share some slides to give you a sense of this place and the period, but only if it works. If it doesn't work, I'll just continue speaking. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to read some of this. Oh gosh, let me just. Oh, there we go. All right. All right. I'm going to start off with a little story. So in 1780, Francois Vaillant, a French Surinese ornithologist, visited the Cape of Good Hope to lead 3 exhibitions into its interior. And he was basically here to hunt and stuff birds for his patron, who was one of the VOC high command, right? So, and when he left the Cape, like many other ornithologists and naturalists who came to the Cape, he described a society that had rapidly changed from 1780 to 1784. And he was particularly struck by what he called a dwaze drift, a foolish passion with which locals clumsily followed every new whim that stemmed from France at the time. So amongst his examples, he described how women across the whole colony indiscriminately piled ribbons, ostrich feathers, and bolts of cloth onto their heads into these tasteless but very costly assemblages. Now, he was not the only person to have noticed this foolish waste of money. From the 1780s until the early 1800s, numerous observers described the Cape of Good Hope as a place where residents suddenly and heedlessly participated in an orgy of vulgar, conspicuous consumption. Townspeople in particular were said to take part in a euphorbia of reckless spending, visiting one another at home dressed in the latest Parisian fashions, in beautiful coaches, some of them gilded, with slaves in livery on the box. Cornelis de Jong van Rodenburg, a Dutch captain of the famous ship Scipio, who visited the Cape from 1792 and 1795, noted that the burghers owned magnificent townhouses, whose building, he said, became not only a hobby, but a passion, a craze, an infectious madness that has affected most of the people, he said. Now, these 2- or 3-story townhouses were fitted, he wrote with some awe, with glass sash windows, often had flat roofs and terraces for promenading, that's walking to all of us, and were filled with expensive furniture, glassware, and porcelain sourced from the Netherlands and further abroad. In them, guests were lavishly entertained, often surrounded by armies of well-dressed slaves who catered to their every whim, but did little other work. At balls, slaves served guests with a wide array of imported drinks and expensively prepared delicacies, while some had the sole duty of fanning the laden tables with green branches or with peacock feather fans. Very soon, the Cape became known as Little Paris. Now, you have to remember this is at a time when Paris was gripped by the French Revolution, and the Cape took on the mantle of this excessive display of wealth. Now, as was the case in mid-18th century Batavia, such intemperance was not confined to the rich, to a private sphere, or to private persons. Indeed, rich burghers, the locals, displayed their wealth on the bodies of their slaves. Free blacks, as people were known, emulated and often bested the dress of modish burghers, and everyone else was apparently desperately trying to keep up. Extravagant public funerals and weddings became so commonplace that the VOC issued public bans to stem this extravagant waste of money, and this was a quote. The British occupation of the Cape from 1795 to 1802 did not seem to stem this tide of excessive consumption. Lady Anne Barnard, a British socialite and the wife of the colonial secretary, stayed at the Cape from March 1797 until January 1802. And in her journals, if you read them, and letters to friends, she writes about endless rounds of dinner and hunting parties, of balls and diversions that the British engaged in. And she continued to, she described as well, the continued vulgar, unsophisticated consumption habits of local Dutch women. In 1798, the British newspapers in London reported that, and I'm quoting, Horse racing, dancing, fiddling, and dissipation have become so general and so popular at the Cape that we suspect the enemy has sent emissaries there to corrupt those whom they cannot subdue by arms. When the colony was back in Dutch hands, Commissioner General de Mist reported to his employer, the state government of the Batavian Republic, that extravagance and indulgence in an unbroken round of amusements and diversions have become to regarded as necessities at the Cape. Resigned, he remarked, it will be the work of years to transform the citizens of Cape Town once again into Netherlanders. The Batavians had little time to effect these change as the Cape fell into the hands of the British government on 10 January 1806. Now, what is extraordinary about this tale of growing public displays of wealth and spending during the latter part of the 18th century and the early 19th is that for much of this period, from 1782 until 1825, the colony had officially completely run out of hard cash or circulating specie. There were also no commercial banks where you could secure a mortgage or borrow money, and borrowing money from private lenders was excessively expensive. So for over 40 years, successive governments at the Cape were forced to print rudimentary paper coins that foreign ships, soldiers, some shopkeepers, and a fair number of farmers in the hinterland refused to accept. As Governor van Plettenberg complained to the VOC chamber in Amsterdam in June 1783, the new paper money was widely considered inconvertible, i.e. people don't want to accept it. And when it was accepted, it was at a considerable discount. So people would only accept it for a lot less than its face value. Now, since the 1950s, obviously this is not unknown, but economic historians have interpreted the issue of paper currency at the Cape in terms of the lack of monetary control. And heavily influenced by a monetary framework, they claimed that the Cape government's reckless printing of inconvertible paper money led to rampant inflation. And my colleague Samvarashi there knows exactly what I'm talking about in the Zimbabwean context, right? So they said, looking back in history, what we had here was a very similar condition, where government printed money when it didn't have any, and that this printing of money, these huge numbers of money being printed, led to an inflation of prices. So in this framework, they followed what Milton Friedman argued was that inflation is caused by too much money chasing after too few goods. My question is this what happened? So in this paper, I trouble this depiction, and I try to show that it is not only ahistorical, but also overly simplistic. So it's overly simplistic to claim that prices will rise or fall directly in relation to money supplies. Or another favorite claim of economists, that bad money drives out good. And I do this, and I trouble this depiction by paying particular attention to the materiality of money, the coins, the paper, the tokens, and the debt books that oiled transactions at the Cape at this time. And I hope to show that inflation at this time was a consequence not of an excessive quantity of money in circulation, but the qualities of the types of money that was in circulation. And the types of money was then tied to types of people. So as such, this paper money that the government printed in huge numbers circulated alongside other, more and less durable mediums of exchange within specific networks of trade and in social circles where trust sometimes undergirded the money in question and in other times was absolutely marginal to its function. So sometimes money needed other people to trust that it was actually what it said it was, and other times it wasn't necessary for other people to trust you to accept money from you, certain types of money. And I'll get to that. Money in the Cape, as I argue, was not a neutral medium of exchange, but was weighted by its symbolic connections to specific classes of people and goods, and it was animated into well-worn grooves of circulation by its materiality. So the fact that some types of money was made of certain types of things meant that it circulated in smaller circles amongst people. So based on its material qualities and who issued it, different types of money circulated within different networks and classes of people to mediate specific types. Now, from 1652, when the VOC started a victualling station at the Cape of Good Hope, until the end of the VOC's rule in 1795, the settlement always traded in a huge multitude of currencies. So what happened is every time a ship came past the Cape, its sailors and its traders would go on land and use the currency that they had on board. And therefore, a lot of this currency was left over in local shops and warehouses. And it was very easily accepted, and interestingly, at exactly the exchange rate that it was exchanged in other places in the world. So Japanese money, for instance, was accepted at the same exchange rate as it was in Japan, in the Cape, right? So we had this huge number of currencies in circulation, or always available in the Cape. But what happened, to make it easier for people to trade with this money, was that every single one of these little currencies, and I'm talking at the moment, I've counted 140 types of currency. What happened was that locals would translate these currencies into a unit of account, which they called the Cape Rix dollar. So the Rix dollar was never a minted coin. And you'll see often when you read about this time, people talk about the Rix dollar, but the Rix dollar wasn't actually a coin. It was actually just a unit of account. So it was a kind of a book money, if you want, right? So every few years, the VOC government at the Cape would publish an official exchange rate table for all the hundreds of currencies that were in circulation at the time. And this was from every single continent. So we had money in the Cape from Japan, China, India, Malaysia, South and North America, and then, of course, all the European currencies as well, right? Now, for its own purposes, the VOC government at the Cape was dependent on the Dutch company to fulfill what they called an annual geldeis, money claim for various metal coins. And these included a variety of Dutch coins, so the silver guilders, stavers, and dubbeltjes, and very occasionally copper duiten, the very smallest denomination in the Netherlands. And that was largely for local circulation to pay their own salaries and the salaries of those that they employed in the Cape. But for international trade, they needed, and I'm talking here specifically for the trade in slaves, because that was one of the, yeah, it's hard to say, but commodities that was traded at the Cape. The company used silver dollars, and these silver dollars came from Spain's South American colonies. There were mines in South America at the time, and all the silver came from there. Now, this kind of silver then was used for international trade, along with scheepsgeld, so ships shillings, and ducatons, riders, they also called it. And so for international trade and to pay, especially sailors, they would use these silver, bigger, heavier coins. All right. But sending these coins to the Cape was extremely expensive. And it was expensive because on the one hand, this money took up a lot of space in a ship's hold. So if it takes up space, you cannot put stuff in the hold. And therefore it's hard to, you lose the trade on the stuff that you could have traded in the East by putting money there. You also had to insure the ships that had money in it, because they were often targeted by pirates, and very unfortunate for the Cape, it was a very stormy coast, or still is a very stormy coast. So shipwrecks were very common. So you had to pay a lot of money to insure a ship that was transporting money to the Cape. Now, in order to recoup this transport cost and the insurance and shipwrecking costs, The VOC, the company, introduced two standards of money in its book. So it had what it called a light gilder for trade settlements and a heavy gilder for the Netherlands. So what it basically meant that was that the same coin would be worth more in the Netherlands than it was in places like South Africa. So in South Africa, the light gilder was called the riksdollar, and it only exchanged for about 16 smaller coins, stavers, whereas in Holland, the same coin would be exchanged for 20 stavers, right? So you get a lot more for your money. Now, at the start, when the VOC introduced this double standard, it helped the company enormously because it meant it could pay 20% less, basically, for its salary bill in the colonies. It also made it easier for the company to deal with a large variety of currencies that it had to deal with, so as it traded with the East. For the company also, unfortunately, it created many opportunities for company officials to enrich themselves by manipulating the different exchange rates between the systems of account. So if you were a wily company official in the Cape, you could manipulate the exchange rates so that you actually got a little bit more than the 16 stavers that you were paid per gilder. Okay. Now, once this money arrived at the Cape, the company struggled to keep it here. And this was a problem from the start of, from 1652 until 1795, that many governors at the Cape had to struggle with. So money would arrive and would almost immediately disappear into the interior and offshore. So apart from the trade with passing ships for slaves and necessities, sailors, VOC employees, and private merchants were eager to smuggle metal coins to the East. So what happened was, if you could get these VOC coins to the East, specifically to Batavia, where the VOC had its main port, you could bank it in a Batavian bank. So as a light coin worth 16 stavers, you can bank it in Batavia. You would then get a chit, a piece of a bill of exchange on it. And then you would send this bill of exchange, this almost, I don't know if any of you know of checks anymore, but there used to be a thing called a check that was equivalent to money. So you would use this check back in Europe and you would deposit it in a bank there. And if you would deposit your money in Europe, you'll get the full heavy gilder price, so the 20 stavers for it, and you would get interest on sending money back to the motherland. So basically, for every one of these coins that you've smuggled to the East and banked in the East, you get 22% more for it in the Netherlands. So if you were very wily, you would try to get as much money everywhere you stopped, going towards the East. Right. So a lot of this money then in the Cape disappeared in this way. Now, another big way in which money disappeared from the Cape was when locals, the burghers who didn't work for the VOC, bought slaves directly from ships. So they would pay in silver, and that would disappear, obviously, from the local economy. Now, a large portion that, and I think this is a lot of historians haven't paid a lot of attention to this, was that a lot of money in the Cape also disappeared into the South African interior, and specifically in the ways in which colonists traded with indigenous people. So although it was outlawed, so from the 1680s, the VOC outlawed trade with indigenous people through the medium of money. Locals, and I'm talking about the settlers and the burghers, had very little option here because the indigenous people said that the trade goods that the VOC had was of such poor quality they didn't want it, they didn't need it, and they often preferred money, silver, because what would happen is they would take this silver into the interior and to both coasts, Delagoa Bay and on the east coast and on the west coast, they would trade with the Portuguese. So they would take this silver coin, especially the silver dollars to both coasts to trade for better things than what the VOC supplied at the Cape. So a lot of money disappeared into the interior as people traded with locals for cattle, ivory, aloe, and tobacco. And so the locals would only accept cash, coins, rather than trade goods. So bartering was something that was very rare, actually, and it goes a little bit against the economic history I think all of us were taught. Anyway, alongside these minted coins of the variety of countries and the VOC coins, many indigenous people also treated cattle, copper, iron, and beads as money equivalents. So things that were exchangeable for one another and for goods and services. And here, if you want to read a little bit more about it, I'm not going to go into it. Geoffrey Pires in 1979 explained this system very well. So he explained how people, especially Xhosa traders, traded cattle for beads or copper, as types of a currency, and they did so as a kind of financial speculation. So it wasn't an exchange of one use value for another. It wasn't barter, he said. He said this was financial speculation, and he shows how that works through these series of trades between groups of people. So networks of transactions, one following the other. And he said we can only understand these trades if we look at where they lead to. And if you do trace them, you see that these trade networks go all the way to Xhosa land, Delagoa Bay, Angola, Botswana, and Natal. So the Cape hinterland was a heavily networked trade network in which these types of currencies were being exchanged across borders quite easily. And what Pires have shown is that there's theoretically almost no losers in these strings of transactions, because it wasn't about the value of beads that was intrinsic, but it was always in relation to the value of cattle. So depending on how rare cattle was. So anyway, all right. So we had money from all over the world at the Cape. We had VOC money, and then we had these indigenous equivalents to money, all of them circulating at the Cape and circulating amongst different types of people and entities. Now, since there was a constant, and there's something else, that it wasn't just that we had, oh, there's someone's, there we go, thank you. It wasn't just all kinds of equivalent types of monies, but we also had certain, the fact that certain types of money was more scarce than others. And like everywhere else in the colonial world, small change was always hard to get by because it's so expensive to send that the VOC would rather send larger denomination silver than small copper dates, which is a very, very small coin. It's like cents today. So in the first instance, small coins were never sent or very seldom sent. And secondly, the VOC basically tried to lower its exports from Europe from 1736. So there's always a shortage of small change. And what happened was that in the absence of these small coins, shopkeepers often gave their patrons small value items such as buttons or beads as change instead of coins. So that was also a form of money that circulated quite easily at the Cape. We also have a case, very interestingly, of some shopkeepers and entities issuing private currencies. So they would issue their own currencies that you can only spend either within chains of shops or within a small area. So they would have little cards that they printed or notes that bore the fractions of money that the customer could then re-spend in a shop, right? And then we see this kind of business all the way into the interior, where indigenous people, traders, and what was known as smosen, so people who would go around trading goods on the back of a wagon, would all issue their own currencies or give change in beads or in small goods. We also have differences in money based on the origins of it. And one of the most famous cases of this was a type of money known, and this was at the time, so please forgive today, we don't use this as a, it's considered a slur, but at the time it was called geld. Now, the word referred to the money that slaves had to bring in each week. So to give you an example, what happened here was in Cape Town, the retail trade in food and skilled trades used to be in the hands of slaves. So many masters at the time would basically live as rentiers. They would hire out their slaves to building contractors, or they would make them go into the streets to sell goods. But then they demanded at the end of the week that their slaves would come back with a certain amount of money. And that certain amount of money was called geld, right? So you didn't have a neutral kind of money all the same. You would have certain kinds of money set apart by who, where it came from. And this money was then also held apart from the household money. So the money that your slave had earned for the week would be set apart for expenses, very specific types of expenses. So you wouldn't spend the geld on, for instance, the tithes you pay to church, right? So the origin of the money, who earned it, also changed how it was spent, all right? For those of you who don't know, I just want to, some of my students don't know it, but we had at the Cape a slave society, so a very important fact of the time. Now, apart from these types of money, there was also the fact that certain types of people did not have to settle transactions on the spot with hard money. So respectable burghers, company servants, and the VOC itself ran up debts with tradesmen, with farmers, and with shopkeepers in what was known as schuldboeken, books of debt. And in these books, people would record what was supplied, to whom, and at what cost. Now, depending on who you were and how creditworthy you were in the eyes of the person that allowed you the debt, you could settle that debt on a monthly basis and or annual basis if you were a farmer living in an outlying district, and sometimes once every few years. So if you're a really rich farmer, you were often allowed to pay a debt, every few years only. You didn't have to settle it at the moment that it was made. There were also other kinds of virtual credit money. So people kept tallies. So if you went to the local baker, he might keep a tally of who bought what from him, and you might only settle once a week. People gave each other promissory notes, IOUs, which could trade as money. You could also, instead of paying money, certain commodities were in high demand. So you could just give someone something. And then in smaller communities and occupational groups or categories of people, so within a guild, within people who were all of the same trade, people simply kept track of who owed what to whom, as we do today, right? So we had all of these kind of stand-ins for money and types of money. And as I said, with this virtual credit money, the horizons of payment shifted in relation to the networks of trust between those transacting. So you usually got longer terms for more trustworthy debtors and shorter ones for less trustworthy ones, right? And this worked because this was a society that was schooled on the idea of status and respectability. So these were central organizing values at the time. So honoring your debt and trusting that your debtors would do the same linked occupational guilds of people, linked businesses, households, and individuals into webs of debt and credit. So at the time, what was very interesting is if you wanted to, at the time, there was very few women at the Cape of European descent. So if you were a company servant and you wanted to marry a European woman, you had to go to other women in the colony to help you to find a woman. But these women would only help you if they knew that you were a man in good credit, in good standing, right? So they would write letters to Batavia telling a prospective wife that you were a man known for settling your debts, right? So these relationships of trust actually extended way beyond just your ability to get more credit. It also meant that your standing in society was determined by it. So if you couldn't honor a debt, if you didn't pay off one of these debts that was in a book or whatever, it would be absolutely disastrous in terms of your ability to keep on living at the Cape. So you had to defend your good name and your reputation as often as you can. And we see this reflected in the Civil Court of the Cape Council of Justice. There's a lot of cases of men who would take people to court for, bringing their good name into ill repute, right? Of course, not everyone was included in such debt networks. So it was sometimes because people are just passing by. So seamen, soldiers, visiting company officials, and others because they occupied such a low position in the social hierarchy that they couldn't be included. Sex workers, slaves, servants, and people who were indigent. So they wouldn't be included in a debt network at all. So for these lowly slaves and sailors and sex workers and servants, it meant that when you transacted with other people, you had to do so immediately, in cash, and in full. So there wasn't terms for you where you could wait and so on and so forth, right? But for visiting company officials and people who are of a better social standing, people like Villand that I opened this paper with, there were other options. So they could offer bills of exchange, these paper checks that I spoke about a little earlier. And they would give these paper checks in the Cape, and then the bearer, the person who accepted the bill of exchange, could then deposit that bill of exchange in Europe or in Batavia at a bank and get their cash, right? And you could get your cash because on the back of the check, it would be endorsed by the person whose account it was or to whom it was transferred. So very often we had these long strings of transferals marked on the back of the check, basically. And if you went to a bank in Europe or in Batavia and the money wasn't in that account, all the people that were on the back of that bill would be liable to pay. Right, so every single one of them would be traced and asked to contribute to the value of the bill because it wasn't no good. Right, so a very interesting way in which people sort of extended horizons of pay. Which brings me finally to this paper money story. So in 1780, there was a total stoppage of any export of specie from the VOC in the Netherlands to the Cape. And it came to a standstill, this export came to a standstill because there was an outbreak of the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. And in this war, what happened was that the British Royal Navy blockaded all Dutch ports and targeted all VOC ships, and all the return fleets were targeted. So you couldn't put a VOC ship to sea. There were also many privateers, what we today call pirates, and they were armed with letters of marque. It's a letter giving you the right to attack a ship. And these privateers then targeted ships from the Dutch Republic. So the VOC could not have any ships on the sea. So what happened in the Cape was that no VOC ships could land for more than 2 years. And it meant that the company was running out of circulating Dutch specie. So the VOC itself, the government, didn't have any cash anymore. And it was particularly acute for them because at the time they had to pay 2 huge complements of soldiers who were sent by the Swiss and by the French to help the Cape to protect itself from the Brits. right? So the de Meuron and the Pondicherry regiments were at the Cape, and these men absolutely refused to accept anything but silver because they were sailors, they were soldiers, and they wanted a medium that would be acceptable somewhere else in the world. So the VOC was very worried at the Cape because they started realizing that they were running out of the silver money. And what they had to do at the time was to print paper money. And I'm going to see if I can't just share my screen with you to give you a sense of what this paper coin looked like. And I'm hoping it will help me to share. Oh, doesn't look like it. Apologies. Right, so I can't show you what these paper coins look like, but to give you just a quick description, it was printed on a piece of paper 8 by 5 centimeters, like this size about, on paper, and it was very, very crude. So basically what they did is they took paper, rubbed it over a piece of coin, with, you all had rubbings when you were children, I would imagine, right? It looked very much like that. And the only thing that made it money was the fact that it bore 3 signatures. And the 3 signatures were easy to forge, and so on and so forth, right? So this is basically what the VOC at the Cape was forced to do with, when they had no circulating. So they printed these coins, as they called it, in quite a few denominations, almost every single denomination you can think of. And they then printed them and handed them out as money, or to use as money. Now, the governor also informed trading companies that stopped at the Cape that these coins were now the new kind of specie at the Cape, and that they had to accept it. They didn't, just in case you were on tenterhooks, right? So they didn't want to accept it. They said, well, what are we going to do with this paper? It looks fake. No one else would want to accept it, right? No surprises. It wasn't just the sailors, but locals as well. So many locals disliked the paper currency, didn't want to accept it, and said that it is inconvertible. No one in the hinterland wanted to accept it. No one accepted that it was real money. It didn't look like it, right? So they wanted to not deal with this at all. All right. Now, like other forms of money, before this paper money was issued, it was not a neutral medium. There was an enormous anxiety over its production. So the first thing that marked this paper money was when van Plettenberg, the governor at the time, issued it. He was very anxious that this new paper money would be handled, or would be in the hands of slaves and other lowly people who sold food on the streets. And because of this paper money, he said, would become soiled. It would be likely to wear out and become unusable. And that the government then had to constantly replace it, right? So gather the worn out and dirty coins, as they were called, and burn it publicly and replace it with clean money. Now, what is interesting about this is that before the issue of paper money at the Cape, the only people who actually handled paper money, the kind of bills of exchange I told you about, the Skuld book and those books of debt and so on, were the rich. So only rich people could issue paper money and use paper money to transact. And suddenly what we have with the issue of this paper coin was that money, paper money, now started circulating amongst the poor as well. And very worrying for an enormously hierarchical society was that slaves were now also using the same money that they used, right? So in the past, people could somehow sanitize the kuligeld that I told you about earlier by using it for very constrained types of expenses. Now, this money could come, this paper money that you might get from a grocer or a baker, can be from anyone. Anyone else could have touched it. So this idea of a polluted currency started circulating at the Cape. All right. So that explains to some extent why rich burghers were unlikely or unhappy to accept it. Right. This idea that there's a mixture of people involved. The VOC continued to use all kinds of other paper money for itself. So it issued letters of credit to its creditors, right? So saying, don't worry, you can go and get the money in the Netherlands or in Batavia. You know, we are good for it. And the same for the rich. The very rich continue to use bills of exchange. So when this paper money was issued, a lot of them started relying heavily on bills of exchange. And what we see from 1765 to 1795 was that company servants and burghers drew about 11 million guilders, and that's a massive amount of money, in bills of exchange on chambers in the Netherlands, right? So all of this money that they transferred was used to pay for all those European goods that I spoke about at the start of this talk. So all these European clothes and coaches and so on and so forth were not paid for by paper money issued by the VOC government, but by bills of exchange on Europe, right? So these rich people found another way to pay, and they started relying very heavily on their own paper, the paper that wasn't sullied by slaves, all right? What also started happening was that the international ships that landed at the Cape, the ones who didn't want to accept this paper money, started treating slaves as currency. So they started saying that they needed clean water and meat and whatever else. They didn't want to accept paper money, or they didn't want to give their good money to people who would give them change in paper money. And they started then negotiating around the amount that a slave would stand for as a denomination in terms of money, right? So it wasn't just a barter of so many slaves, but actually a slave standing for a certain denomination, right? So a very dark period in our history. And then very interestingly, locals also started turning to other financial instruments. So we see in this time the rise of lotteries. And you could see my earlier research in lotteries coming up here. And what we start seeing at this time was that large numbers of burghers and company servants started selling their houses, their slaves, and their property by lottery. So they would take, let's say they had a house worth in today's money 100 Rand. They would break up that house into 100 lots, sell those lots for R1 each, and most people at the time had enough rands that they hoarded to participate in the lottery. And that allowed people then to have a big sum of money, 100 Rand if in today's terms, to leave the Cape with. Otherwise, they would lose all their money, right? Because there was not enough money. No one had pots of money available, enough of it to allow them to leave. So what happened was they would then start selling by lottery. All right, so we have a lot of evidence of that. What was frightening for many people at the Cape at the time, though, was that within the classes of people who could hold lotteries, not necessarily just participate in them, but hold lotteries, was that lotteries were enormously threatening. Because the lotteries, what they did is they started loosening the webs that tied moneyed individuals in the Cape into webs of obligation and debt. So what we have here is suddenly the possibility that a freed slave, for instance, could get together the lot money. So they might have, from their coolie geld, could have saved up the gilde necessary to participate in the lottery and therefore become themselves a burgher with a house, with slaves and carts and so on and so forth. So it was a very threatening financial instrument. And before we knew it, 1789, it was banned by the VOC. So it's because of all this outrage amongst burghers about these lotteries and basically what it could do to money, number one, but also to the webs that kept money, the things that we call money, in circulation, right? We also have at the same time absolute blooming in what I earlier called paper money. The most famous one that we have at the time is called slachtersbriefjes, so butchers' letters, that was issued by Cape butchers to their clients in the outlying districts. So the butchers in Cape Town got most of their meat from the eastern districts, and instead of giving those farmers money, they used to give them these letters of credit. And then these farmers were supposed to come to town and then trade with the letter itself at the shops where they needed things like sugar and salt and so on and so forth. And then interestingly, we also started seeing things like the London Missionary Society started to mint its own coins on some of its mission stations. So the Griqua, for instance, there was a Griqua coin minted in the 1817s on silver and was meant as a circulating medium in the absence of good money. So in the absence of acceptable good money from the government. All right. My question, and I'm wrapping up, Simbarashi, is what can we learn from this profusion of mediums and exchanges of money? And I think the one lesson that we can take from this is that there was, from the start, an order of things and of people in the Cape's economy. And that paper money did not simply replace specie, the hard coins, to do the same kind of work or to translate value across the same order of things. Paper money did not chase after the same goods as coin. They each had their own realms of exchangeability. So paper money can only be accepted, or was only accepted, in certain very specific types of transactions, not in all. In essence, paper money, the money that the government issued, was meant to circulate often and across many transactions, unlike coin and virtual debt that animated in much longer cycles. The inconvertibility of the paper riksdollar, the one that the government issued, in this context was thus not an economic problem of government monetary policy and inflation, but about the orders of people and things, of shorter and longer time horizons, of very different kinds of transactions. That's it. Simbarashi, that's the end.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lana, for such a fascinating talk on the ecology of money and the complexities of transactions that were happening at the Cape. I think it's quite interesting, especially given maybe the centrality of the Cape from Europe to the Indies. And quite a number of interesting insights that you have highlighted there. So I think let me quickly open this up. I'm quite conscious that you have something that you need to attend to very soon. So
much later, don't worry.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for that. So let me open this up for questions and comments. I'm sure there are colleagues that might have questions and comments for Ilana. Yes, Godfrey, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ilana. I think we last met, I think it should be 2018.
That's it, Godfrey.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. But I wanted to find out from you, from your research, at what point does money changes its form? What I mean is sometimes money is very social. At another point, you realize that money becomes very political. So at what point does it change its form? I know from your historical perspective at the Cape, how that can be understood. Thank you very much, Ella.
Thank you, Godfrey. So Simbarashi, shall I answer the questions as they come in, and then we can give people a bit of time to think?
Yeah, sure.
Right. Thank you, Godfrey. Absolutely. They are not, and this is the I want to get away from the economists' treatment of money as something that is neutral and sort of, one type of money is almost exactly the same as another. And in this, and this is why I paid so much attention to the different types of money. It depends on the actual type of money. So, for instance, at what point you asked, does it change? For instance, for the trade dollar, the silver dollar, it does not change easily. I mean, the trade dollar, the silver dollar from South America, was commonly traded across the whole world. This was the common currency for all countries. So we didn't have at this time national currencies that only stayed within a country. So the silver dollar, everyone knew exactly how to read it. It was a certain weight, a certain fineness of silver. And whether you're going to South America or India or China, people would accept it for the same thing. So it was so recognizable and acceptable across the world that its form did not change, right? So people would easily accept it. But when does it change its form? And this is what we see in the Cape, Godfrey, is for instance, when we start seeing paper money, especially the ones that the company printed, there's really poor quality. And I'm sorry I couldn't show you a picture. I had a whole picture gallery here, but in any case, it was such a poor quality that its materiality itself alerted the person who was, had to accept it to its possible fraudulent nature. So we had silver money, across the world circulating. We had a silver standard at the time. It wasn't a gold standard. And people would, by sight, know what kind of money was printed where and whether it was sort of trustworthy, i.e., if no one wants to accept it, I can go and melt it down, for something else. And someone would accept the silver content itself, right? So money was trading almost at face value. But when you have something that is so obviously and easily faked, as was the case with the Cape paper money, that is when it changes. So the first way in which it changes its form, its convertibility, if you want, its fungibility, as the economists know it, is when we look at its material qualities, and that we see in the Cape very clearly with the paper money. And the government was constantly changing the design and who signed it. And so people in the interior who are not part of the circuits of information would often not accept the latest version because, it looks not like the others. So definitely, I would say the materiality we need to take much more seriously. But also, I think when society changes, we have at these margins, at these frontiers, where different kinds of people come into contact, we have a change in its form as well. So, for instance, as money moved from Cape Town into the interior and becomes, in Cape Town, you would take your cash and you might buy a head of cattle. That head of cattle then trades as money against beads, iron, and so on and so forth, as it, kind of goes into the interior. So there are many ways in which money changes its form. And so I think the first one is its materiality, and then secondly, these frontiers it crosses. That's and then, of course, as a historian, you would appreciate under severe stress, money becomes more and less valuable depending on how much trust people have in the trading partners they have. And that's why, for instance, even the bills of exchange under severe stress in the Cape at certain periods, and I obviously can't get to that in this talk, but would trade at a severe discount. So, even though the bill of exchange on its face would be worth, let's say, 100 guilders, it would be discounted by the person accepting it as money by 25 and sometimes up to 60%. And it is because they were under severe stress and they didn't trust that the person who were giving them this bill would be able to, or that there would be money in the bank in Europe and so on. I hope that answers you, Godfrey. Good. There's a Chantel.
Yes, it does, Ilana. Thank you very much. At least you can see me. Yeah, thank you.
Good to see your face again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I see Chantel. I think maybe after Chantel, I can throw in a couple of questions of mine as well. so
I'm
that
looking
you
for the
just
inflation question, Simbarashi.
yes.
Thank you so much. Afternoon, Prof. Thank you so much for the talk. It was very interesting. I mean, it was very interesting to learn about how, like, in retrospect, it shows how money was never really neutral in whatever it's formed. It basically shaped who could participate in economic life and what, these communities valued, and as well as how, power was contested. So I basically wanted to throw this at you to find out, do you think that these lotteries and as well as now the slaves' participation in these credit systems, do you view them as forms of resistance or subversions within these colonial economies?
Chantal, that used to be in history a very common way to look at any kind of otherness, as a form of subversion. But very often, the slaves didn't have a choice at all. They were, pumped out, if you want, by their owners, and they had to, sort of go and sell stuff. What they did do, and I think that is interesting, is what they did with the kuligeld, and I'm using this word because that's the word used at the time, was some of them, this allowed them, and this can be read as a form of resistance, allowed them to buy their own freedom and the freedom of their loved ones. So there are beautiful stories in our archives of people who were enslaved, who used the extra, so after they've paid their kuligeld to their owner, they would be able to save up money to buy their own freedom or the freedom of their children. And so that allowed a form of resistance in subverting the ownership of people. So in that sense, I would say that's the case. The lottery, the people who held the lotteries, the ones who were selling houses and slaves and carts and so on by lottery, were certainly not trying to undermine the system at all. They were angry at the VOC for not managing the flow of money in the colony at the time. But for most of them, they just tried to get out of the colony, and there wasn't enough money. No single person had enough money to buy a house. They didn't have a horde of guilders to be able to do so. So this was a very practical solution to a shortage of money. So I wouldn't read their holding of lotteries as a resistance at all. But it was read as a subversion of the system in its unintended consequences. So it was definitely a threat to the status quo once its consequences started working itself out. I don't know if that answers you, Chantal.
No, thank you so much. Definitely.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, see, Ushe, go ahead.
All right. Here I'm trying to get my system working. Can you hear me?
I can and see you, Ushe.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much, Ilan. This is my first time to encounter your works, and I was really impressed about how this sort of interfaces with. You may have met or heard of Tinashe Nyamunda's works on monetary histories. He's been doing a lot on monetary histories in Zimbabwean context, and I think there's a piece they wrote with Msewa on Southern African monetary regimes, and from pre-colonial and so on. And there's a lot of overlap there, which I found very, very fascinating. And having also worked on a paper on the Zimbabwean monetary regime in a crisis space, some of the things that you referred to, I've also find them fascinating, particularly the challenge. I mean, the question you pose that challenges economists' understanding of inflation, for example. Too much money chasing too few goods, or bad money. This moment context really complicates that kind of understanding, because you have bad money alongside good money, so to speak, because that bad money is relative. It's bad in a certain context, but it's good for certain transactions, and so you can't really call money bad, and you can't paint it bad or good. black or white in that kind of sense, right? It's very fluid. And I love how how you then historicize this and demonstrate that in your own research. But my question then is, from your research, do you see that research sort of dismissing completely or totally those fundamentals, economist fundamentals, or what it does is complicate it rather than dismiss it, right? Would you totally say in your own case study, I mean, you throw completely the idea or the rationale that too much money leads to inflation? Or what your own study does is to complicate that conversation rather than dismiss the conversation. I hope that makes that
absolutely no, absolutely.
Because I've been grappling with the same kind of when I was writing a piece on Zimbabwe's inflation, and I was wondering if I'm dismissing or I'm just complicating the conversation rather than dismissing that kind of yeah.
It's hard to say if economists, what often happens today is many economists look back at the past as if it's the same as modern nationalist economies. So for the Cape, for instance, they treat the Cape as if it is a singular economy with closed borders within which something like the introduction of paper money would lead to inflation, right? And that is totally ahistorical, doesn't take into account all these ways in which, number one, it wasn't a closed economy. Number one, this economy had all these ways in which money disappeared into an interior that stretched thousands of kilometers, number one, and that were participating in networks well beyond its own scope, right? So that's the first thing. They also don't acknowledge the fact that you didn't have a government with a monetary policy that controlled the flow of money within its borders. So the government at the time wasn't even a government, it was a company. And the company was interested in paying its own bills, right? So it didn't have a policy for trying to figure out how much money was in circulation and then to ask the Netherlands to send them more because there was a shortage or whatever else. Basically, all they needed was for their own expenses and, to have a currency. So it misunderstands monetary policy, it misunderstands the size of the economy, how the economy worked. It also misunderstands types of money, that money, and I think the more we look at historical, examples, we learn this lesson over and over and over again. And I think, I'm hard pressed to pull it into the current, to modern day scenarios, but we start seeing very similar things. And I think you saw it in Zimbabwe as well. When people run out of dollars, they make a plan with something else. Dr. Gukarume, for instance, knew very well that if your dollars run out, you can start trading pigs, or chickens or whatever else. So this idea that money is sort of endlessly fungible, and not everyone accepts the dollar, because there were printers who were printing off dollars that were not real, the fake dollars and so on and so forth. So I think, economists might be right, true, correct, for maybe some modern contexts, but I think anthropologists and historians are increasingly asking the question about the fundamental, these fundamentals, as you say, more money leads to inflation. Depends on, whether that system is totally contained, whether, only one single currency is in circulation there. And as I said, as you also showed, bad money doesn't drive out good. There are always pockets in which these good money or bad money can become good for some things, so it's hard to dismiss all economic fundamentals, but I think definitely for the period I'm working in, they're wrong. I think they're absolutely wrong. They misunderstand so many basics of their theories don't do the work that they think it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a bon, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ushe and Ilana. Yeah, I wanted to pick also on something that you highlighted, which I think was quite fascinating around what happens when money travels and the temporalities and spatialities of money, either from the Cape to the interior or from the Cape to, let's say, the Netherlands. I think there's an example that you gave that the money, the same kind of money at the Cape, might actually be worth more when you go to the Netherlands. And I just wanted you to speak a little bit about that. And then I think the other issue that I wanted to also focus on is on the indigenous logics, economic logics, and the interactions, especially between the local and the foreign systems of value. And my question then would be, how did these local understandings of value and exchange shape, especially the adoption, but also the resistance of foreign currencies within the Cape? I think we're dealing with a system where there was an ecology of currencies based on, the traders that were coming to the Cape.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much, Samarashi. Yeah, the same money was basically company policy. So what happened was the VOC as a company decided that because it's so expensive to send money abroad to all its colonies, all its outposts, as they called it, factories, at the Cape, India, Malaysia, the whole East, the money would be lighter on the books. So it would be worth less when it goes abroad, and it would save money for itself. But if you take the actual coin, because it's the same coin, whether it's a heavy or a light guilder, it's exactly the same coin. So once it gets to the Cape, it's worth less. But if you bank that same coin in Batavia, it will be banked at the rate of a guilder. So it becomes, and when you pull that money back in Europe, it will be heavier again, so you make 22% on that money. And it's basically a way for the company itself. Now, remember, this was a mercantile period, so a period in which countries and big companies like the VOC tried to not send silver abroad, because if you send silver abroad, they felt that you would become poorer by it, right? And we know from Ricardo and other economists at the time, and these are the good economists, Oshoedu, the ones who said, well, actually, having money and having debt as a country is not a bad thing. But anyway, so it's a mercantile period in which they try to stop silver leaving their coffers. So for them, it was a way to control this silver leaving their coffers. And it led to these unintended consequences, which was that people tried to take their money to the East and steal the money, despite all kinds of laws against it in the Cape. So, this money then, once you steal it, it becomes worth more. And it actually went against their policy. And because they had such a slow reckoning with money on their books, and they didn't always take into account that on their books in the Cape it was light guilders rather than heavy guilders. The accountants, remember, they were not trained to the same standard that some of ours are today. So they didn't realize this for a good 40 years that they've been they've been stolen from. So for a good 40 years the company didn't realize what was going on, and they continued losing enormous sums of money. So it was actually, incompetence and understanding of the world of money that led to this weird traveling of money and undermining of the company. About indigenous logic, and this is something, one of the main points of this book I'm working on is exactly that. What a lot of us have been taught is that when these companies like the VOC and so on came to places like the Cape, what they encountered were bartering systems, and that what they did is they introduced money, this fungible medium of exchange, and therefore modernized people's understanding of local logics. And that's actually absolutely untrue. So when Jan van Riebeeck, for instance, landed at the Cape, people had long been trading, indigenous people had long been trading with the Portuguese, with the Chinese, and so on and so forth, both in the interior and on the coasts, in the medium of money. And they themselves were actually trading, and we have a lot of evidence of smelting iron, of them smelting copper and iron in the interior and trading that with other, both European and Asian traders. So there's this misunderstanding of this in South Africa, what the old nationalists taught us was that, these Europeans brought this understanding of money. Actually, it existed long before the Dutch came. So what we have is and it's the Dutch that actually introduced barter. They made it illegal for people to trade, both the company and people settling around it in the Cape, to trade with money with indigenous people. And there was constantly and Chantal's question here, that was constantly undermined, because actually the party that was that needed the trade more was the VOC and the settlers. They needed the fresh meat and the ivory and so on from the indigenous people much more than the indigenous people needed, crappy bartering goods. And that is why indigenous people could demand money instead of crappy. The Dutch were making this really bad Basque, it's a kind of porcelain that was really brittle. And the locals just said, it's useless stuff. I can get much better porcelain from China with money, So the indigenous logic, that's the one logic that was, I think, often misunderstood in economic histories of this part of the world. I think the second one is, and it's tied to this idea that indigenous people only bartered like for like, or use value stuff for use value stuff. And actually what we have is a very sophisticated trade in which people, like in West Africa, where they basically had all kinds of financial speculation systems going. So you would know, people knew how much the beads that they exchanged cattle for were going for on each coast. So they were not easily bamboozled. And we have a lot of tales of especially VOC company servants who went to Europe, Venetia especially, to go and buy beads, hoping that they can, bamboozle locals out of all kinds of things with this beads. And the locals just dismissed this beads and said, well, this is not the trade beads that we can use on the East Coast, because the stuff that we can use with the Arab traders on the East Coast were all the glass beads from North India, right? So we have a very sophisticated indigenous population. It is not at the same time the kind of unsophisticated economic rationality that we have in the myths of the period. Actually, we have a very, very wily, sophisticated traded, and in many of these transactions, the VOC came off second best. And I think it gives us a new version of that first contact, and I'm putting it in total inverted commas, and a very different way in which we can look at subversion and resistance. Does that answer your question, Simba?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Ilana. I don't know if there's more questions. I think maybe this will be the last round of questions, if there are any more questions. But maybe as we wait, and maybe I'll just throw in another one, which I think you highlighted, I think something that's very interesting around trust, in the ways in which these transactions were taking place. But at the same time, I think the Cape was a space of encounter of a very cosmopolitan kind of population. So maybe across linguistic, cultural, racial, and even political boundaries within the Cape, that the people that converged at the Cape. How did this idea of trust, how was it established and maintained over time, especially maybe in a context where, or in situations where there are delayed exchanges, or maybe there's credit or even debt?
Yeah. Thank you, Simba. Yeah, absolutely. There are many ways in which trust was, and it depended on the people, right? So within the upper crust, this is a very hierarchical society at this time, right? It's a slave society, so hierarchy is extremely important. So in the upper crust, that trust was established not only by your deeds, but also, as I said, by these networks of gossip that was spread through the empire. So we have evidence of, especially people, women's letters that was spread across the whole empire, the VOC empire, telling other settler societies who's trustworthy and who's not, you know, who can't pay their bills and who would therefore be a good husband to their daughters and so on. So that was one very, very important way in which trust was built. So, you know, whether you have a good reputation amongst these matriarchs who were sending news across many, many frontiers. Another way in which trust was built, and this was more on in the hinterland amongst settlers, was by marriage. So extremely important for people in the hinterland to marry their sons and daughters within known families. So that, you know, the farm would stay in the same family, that the business would stay in the same or known families. So marriage was extremely important as a mechanism to establish trust. And I think another way in which trust was established was also just in terms of class. So men of the same class who worked for the company would know where to and banked with the same bank and so on and so forth, had these chains and networks of business that tied them into a risk sort of, what do you call it? Chains of risk. So that's why we had at the time huge bubbles, you know, the South Sea Island, the South Sea bubble, for instance. It is all because when you take out a loan, you had to have people stand surety for you. So you have to trust and make sure you know their business. Otherwise, your downfall would be tied to theirs. So we have these chains of networks. That's how money worked at the time. And then very interestingly, just being neighbors. So on the eastern frontier, where we had enormous fighting amongst settlers and the Xhosa especially, we have very interesting cases of people who start across that racial and colonial settler versus indigenous people divide, started trusting each other with debt. You know, so we have these cases of settlers borrowing from indigenous people, cows and so on and so forth. And they would then hold these cows and would pay interest in terms of the calves from those cows, you know. So interesting that it isn't just within like for like kind of society, but, you know, across these racial boundaries, we get stories that look different from the antagonism of war that we often read. So these ways in which people also establish trust because they need to. They you know, these farmers on the farming settlers I'm talking about on those frontiers were often very impoverished, and them and their families could not live unless they established trusting relationships with neighbors. Obviously, those fell apart when there's a war, but there were, you know, periods in which peace led to these kind of exchanges and trust and debt and so on relationships.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ilana. I think the last would be Tamuka. I think Tamuka, if you're still here, I think Ilana would be happy to see you as well, and throw in your question. Tamuka joined a bit late, but has thrown a question on the chat box.
Oh, sorry, Tamuka, I didn't see it.
Tamuka, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Can you see me?
Not yet. Yeah, there we
Yes.
go.
Oh, hello,
Tamuka.
Ilana. How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm sorry. I was attending a conference that just ended at 1. So yeah. But I'd thrown my question in the chat box. Probably let me just try to understand. I was just trying to understand, you know, the circulation of goods and everything that happened in the Cape back then. Can we draw parallels between that transactions that were happening there and contemporary transactions, particularly looking at migrant remittances?
Tamuka, I think it would be hard because we didn't have the same kind of migratory patterns. What we did have, and I think we had, for instance, directly butting up against the VOC's expansion and whatever else, we had the Xhosa land, the lands of people who were settled, were I call it financially, but financially quite secure, had herds of cattle, quite, and they had these trading relationships, both with the VOC, Arab, Zulu, Tswana, and so on, traders elsewhere in the interior that they traded with. So we had a settled population of people who were pretty well to do. The people who did, kind of migrate for work were the people that today, in the historical record, were known as the Khoikhoi or the Khoi. And at the time, they were absolutely devastated by the colonial, well, the start of a colonial era. And they were devastated by smallpox. They were devastated by, the intrusion of their land and so on and so forth. And these people then became the migrant laborers on settler farms, not at Xhosa at first. So it was a people that was under enormous stress. Their land was taken away, and there was a lot of death because of the contact with the VOC settlers. And they became a people without land, a people without settlement, and they became laborers on farms. Some of them became very wily speculators, as Jeffrey Pires showed us, in the trade then with the Xhosa land, men who owned cattle and so on and so forth. But we don't have those migratory patterns yet. It's, I think only much later that we can look at the remittances working the same way. At this stage, we had whole groups of people like the Xhosa, unfortunately, kind of denuded of a lot of agency because of the damage of the contact. But you had the Xhosa, living economically quite stable lives, and we see that only in the late 1800s starting to come under threat much more, and especially after Nonhlu's prophecy, with the great cattle killings and so on, that we start seeing a precipitous decline of prosperity, and those people then becoming migrant laborers and then starting to set up migratory remittances and those patterns that would mark the age of discovery, as the colonists called it. But thanks for alerting me to that. Thanks, Tamuka. Brilliant.
Yeah,
Thanks
thanks, Tamuka and Ilana. I think there's a last comment from Josiah here. He's saying thank you for a fascinating talk. It reminded me of the idea that money is a money bank. It mediates our relationship to and within society. Your talk dismisses the often held the often held idea that money and the state are two sides of the same coin. People's money is issued outside of the state. So I think it's just a comment there from Josiah, which I think is it's interesting and also resonates with some of the last point that I wanted to make around the ecology of currencies within the Cape, and especially given that we had quite a number of people interacting there. Were there any cases maybe where we see the emergence of some kind of hybridized or maybe syncretic kind of economic practices, maybe that are outside the VOC informally within the Cape? That would be the last, Ilana, and then we'll
Thank you, Samarashi. You obviously came with the stick right at the end. In terms of syncretism, or lotteries themselves are very interesting, because the VOC used lotteries in the Netherlands to actually gather capital when it started suffering, right? So it set up lotteries in the Netherlands to make money for itself. So for the colonists then in the Cape to hold lotteries, but to a very different end. You can maybe call a syncretic practice, and definitely against the interests of the VOC, because what it did is it drained the few pots of VOC coins that were held in people's money banks and under the mattresses. It pulled it out of circulation completely, and that person who held a lottery would take that pot of money and leave the colony, and therefore undermine. So it's this, sort of a very interesting case of using an instrument that the VOC itself had used in the Netherlands and that had been in circulation in Europe for, at least since the early 1400s as a financial instrument, especially with the issuing of bonds, government bonds, and so on. It was a very popular way for governments to get around the problem of people not wanting to pay taxes, but to use that same instrument to basically get around a state that cannot do its work, and to undermine its ability to do so in the future, I think is a very interesting case. But I'll have to think of more of Simvarashi. I'm sure there are many more, because people are endlessly creative when it comes around, to getting stuff that they want. And as I said, people at the Cape wanted a lot of stuff. So without money, you had to make many plans. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ilana. We really appreciate, and I'm quite excited that you managed to find the time to share your insights with us. And Chantel is one of my master's graduates, and I'm excited that she was in and managed to engage my PhD supervisor. So yeah,
there's a face.
Thank you very
Great.
much. Yes, thank you very much, Ilana, for for taking
amazing,
time.
yes.
Yeah,
I love these.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. No, thank you, Simvarashi, and to any anthropologists out there. This is how genealogies are kept alive.
yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone who has joined us today. We really appreciate taking time. And if you want to join our mailing list, you can send through your email, and we'll be happy to invite you. We host these events every week during the semester. And it's a culture that we brought from Yuma, like what Ilana highlighted. And thank you very much, Ilana. Let me take this opportunity to thank you for sharing your work with us and allowing us to engage your work. And we'll definitely invite you again because we always benefit from your work.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity and the wonderful questions. It has been very productive for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. And all the best with the meeting, Ilana, the PhD meeting.
Luckily, it's not mine. I'm just tearing.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Talent, Talent, is there a comment? Sorry. I'm seeing it late.
No, it's not a comment. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Doc, are you in your office?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll come there in a few seconds.
Okay, thank you.
Goodbye.